Good morning, and today I'd like to continue talking about the possible threat to religious liberty and freedom of conscience posed by a possible Islamophobia bill being debated and considered by the Labour government. Now, I am absolutely convinced that people must be protected from racism and racist persecution. We have seen a rise in Islamophobia, genuine hatred of Muslims, and the attacks on mosques and asylum seekers and the hotels in which they were housed during the riots a few weeks ago were totally abhorrent. But there are dangers. The term Islamophobia was invented by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and it was deliberately invented to prevent criticism of Islam. He could crack down on critics of Islam and atheists and religious nonconformists in Iran through the use of the law and the police. But he couldn't prevent it being criticised and denigrated in the outside world. So he invented Islamophobia as a way of connecting it to racism. Now, the issue is that the definition of Islamophobia, which seems to have been accepted by all the mainstream political parties with the exception of the Tories and Reform, is that it appears to conflate criticism of Islam with the persecution of individual Muslims. Now, this is a danger to our religious liberty. The last execution for atheism in this country was in the 1680s. Atheist exclusion from government became a dead letter with the election of Charles Bradlaugh in the late 19th century, and the last prosecution for blasphemy was in the 1970s when Mary Whitehouse brought up a case against gay news. Now, I'm going back to the entry on blasphemy in the Oxford Dictionary of World Religions, edited by John Bowker. Right, this here. And the entry says, blasphemy, Greek, speaking evil, impious or profane talk, especially against God, and in many Western legal systems, the offence of reviling God or Jesus Christ or an established church. To be blasphemous, a publication must be intended to shock and endanger the moral fabric of society. One that is merely anti-religious, e.g. denying the existence of God, is not. In England in 1977, the editor of Gay News was convicted of blasphemous libel for publishing a poem which portrayed Jesus as a practicing homosexual. This was the first successful prosecution for blasphemy since 1922 and showed the difficulty of objectively applying the common law definition. The appearance of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses raised the issue whether blasphemy should be extended to become a more general offence in the UK, or whether it is an offence in the domain of inciting unrest. Now, I think the latter is the argument on which the Islamophobia debate rests. And as we've seen, Muslim mobs have resulted in a teacher in Batley having to go into hiding because he showed the Mohammed cartoons in class, and the Muslim community there objected. And then there was the case of the young lad in Keighley who had death threats sent to him and Muslim outrage because he threw his own copy of the Quran on the floor and scuffed it. And this resulted in his mother, accompanied by the police, going around the mosques, the local mosque, and basically pleading for her son's life. This is outrageous. This is just mob rule. Now, after discussing blasphemy in Judaism, it then moves on to Islam. And the entry says, the nearest equivalent in Islam is sab, offering an insult to God. Quran 974 condemns those who swear by God that they said nothing, but in fact spoke a word of rejection, kalimat al-kufr, after they had become Muslim. This relates blasphemy closely to apostasy, ridda. The expression of contempt for God, the Prophet Mohammed, the angels, or the traditional religious explications of revelation constitutes the offence. Accidental blasphemy is not usually excusable, although the Malikites allow it if it is expressed by a recent convert to Islam. The punishment varies between the different schools of Islamic law, e.g. the Hanafites remove the offender's legal rights, declare his marriage invalid, and declare any claims to inheritance or property void. The Malikites demand immediate execution of the death penalty. This is certainly the case in Pakistan at the moment, which has a death penalty for blasphemy. It is often used maliciously by people just involved in a dispute, and particularly against Christians and other non-Muslims. There are 200 people sat at the moment in death row for this non-offence. That's unacceptable, utterly despicable. Now we come to the question of deconversion. Islam also forbids apostasy, which is when someone converts either to atheism or to another religion. This is in a popular dictionary of Islam written by Ian Richard Netton, right? Irtad, Arabic. Apostasy, also called ridda in Arabic. An apostate is called a murtad. The death penalty for apostasy is not prescribed in the Quran itself, but is articulated in both the hadith literature and fiqh. See bida, had, ilhad. The hadith literature are the traditions about the Prophet Mohammed, and they form, along with the Quran, they form the basis for Muslim jurisprudence, which is fiqh. Now, I talked in a previous video about the British Civil War and the arguments for liberty of conscience which were articulated during it and against religious persecution. I've also talked about, in one of my blog posts, I have a blog, about similar arguments being advanced in the 16th century, by a variety of religious preachers and intellectuals, from Protestants through to Cardinal Allen, who said that you should not try to convert anyone to force, even Jews and Turks, by which he meant Muslims. Now, the great Quaker evangelist William Penn also wrote several pamphlets arguing for freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. They were at a time just after the British Civil War, when Protestant dissenters particularly were excluded from government and subject to persecution. Now, these arguments and pamphlets have been are contained in a collection of his writings, published by Everyman, and they include The Peace of Europe, The Fruits of Solitude, and other writings, edited by, let's have a look, Edwin B. Bronner of Haverford College, Pennsylvania. And they include essays for the general reader, an essay towards the present and future peace of Europe, in which he advocates something like a modern European Parliament. Some Fruits of Solitude, more Fruits of Solitude, Fruits of a Father's Love, a letter from William Penn, proprietor and governor of Pennsylvania, in which he talks about how wonderful his new state was. He founded it, and praises the Indian population. Writings on religious liberty. The people's ancient and just liberties asserted, of 1670. This was written when Penn and his fellow Quaker evangelist Mead were prosecuted in Bristol for seditious blasphemy. They were, the jury, however, disagreed and passed a verdict of not guilty, which annoyed the judge, who repeatedly ordered them to go back and reconsider. And this case eventually led to the legal injunction that you cannot do this. Once the jury have spoken, that's it. You can't have the judge send them back to reconsider their verdict. And he talks about how law-abiding Protestant nonconformists are being robbed of their liberty and property in the name of an established church. Right? The Great Case of Liberty and Conscience, 153, and a Persuasive to Moderation to Dissenting Christians of 1685. Right, and then it goes on to writings about Quaker faith and practice, primitive Christianity revived in the faith and practice of the people called Quakers, 1696, a brief account of the rise and progress of the people called Quakers, 1694. Now, it's the Great Case of Liberty and Conscience and a Persuasive to Moderation to Dissenting Christians that are most relevant in this case. Penn pulls out arguments from scripture, philosophy, and the politics of his own day to attack assaults on freedom of conscience, and particularly against and other Christian sects. In the case of a persuasion to moderation, he even goes so far as to say that the king should not style himself the head of a Protestant league, but should consider himself the head of a Christian league, including all Christians, including the various sects, some of which are very radical, like the Socinians, who denied Christ's divinity. Now, Penn draws on scripture. As a good Christian, he draws on the Bible. He also draws on religious liberty in other nations, going right back to antiquity, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, Rome. He even talks about Persia and Turkey, where he says there are people of numerous sects and what concord there is between them. That's not quite true. I mean, there has been an ongoing battle between the great branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia, now, for well over 1,000 years. And you can say that more Muslims have been killed in these wars than were ever killed by Crusaders. In fact, the Crusades for a long time were regarded as just a side issue. They didn't really affect the real conflict as it was seen by Muslims themselves, which was the battle between Sunni and Shia. But he also talks about various arrangements in various foreign states, where the princes are, even though they are maybe Roman Catholic, Calvinist, Lutheran, in Germany, are nevertheless letting people of different faiths worship. He also talks about the great contribution the nonconformist Christians have made to Britain and their loyalty, and says, if you allow people the freedom of conscience and let them carry on in peace as normal citizens, then this benefits the state. They work hard, they're industrious, again. Now, one thing I'd like to read out here is is chapter 4 of Liberty of Conscience. We live in a secular society, and I don't think many people will be persuaded by arguments from the Bible. But he also argues from reason. And he says in chapter 4 of Liberty of Conscience, they are enemies to the privilege of nature, 1, as rendering some more and others less than men, 2, as subverting the universal good that is God's gifts to men, 3, as destroying all natural affection. Next, they are enemies to the noble principle of reason, as appears in 8 great instances. We farther say that imposition, restraint, and persecution are also destructive of the great privilege of nature and principle of reason. On nature in three instances. First, if God Almighty has made of one blood all nations, as himself has declared, and that he has given them both senses corporal and intellectual to discern things and their differences, so as to assert or deny from evidences and reasons proper to each, then where any enacts the belief or disbelief of anything upon the rest, or restrains any from the exercise of their faith to them indispensable, such exalts himself beyond his bounds, enslaves his fellow creatures, invades their right of liberty, and so perverts the whole order of nature. Secondly, mankind is hereby robbed of the use and benefit of that instinct of a deity which is so natural to him that he can be no more without it, and be than he can be without the most essential part of himself. For to what serves that divine principle in the universality of mankind, if men be restricted by the prescriptions of some individuals? But if the excellent nature of it inclines men to God, not man, if the power of accusing and excusing be committed to it, if the troubled thoughts and sad reflections of forlorn and dying men make their tendency that way only, as being hopeless of all other relief and succour from any external power or command, what shall we say, but that such as invalidate the authority of this heavenly instinct, as imposition and restraint evidently do, destroy nature, or that privilege which men are born with and to. Thirdly, all natural affection is destroyed, for those who have so little tenderness as to persecute men, that cannot for conscience sake yield them compliance, manifestly act injuriously to their fellow creatures, and consequently are enemies to nature. For nature being one in all, such as ruin those who are equally entitled with themselves to nature, ruin it in them, as in liberty, property, etc., and so bring the state of nature to the state of war, the great Leviathan of the times, as ignorantly as boldly does assert. But secondly, we also prove them destructive of the noble principle of reason, and that in these 8 particulars, and that those who impose or restrain are uncertain of the truth, and the justifiableness of their actions in either of these, their own discourses and confessions are pregnant instances, where they tell us that they do not pretend to be infallible, only they humbly conceive it thus, or it is not. Since then they are uncertain and infallible, how can they impose upon or restrain others whom they are so far from assuring, as they are not able to do so much for themselves? What is this but to impose an uncertain faith upon certain penalties? As he that acts doubtfully is damned, so faith in all acts of religion is necessary. Now in order to believe we must first will. To will we must judge. To judge anything we must first understand. If then we cannot be said to understand anything against our understanding, no more can we judge, will, or believe against our understanding. And if the doubter be damned, what must he be that conforms directly against his judgment and belief, and they likewise that require it from him? In short, that man cannot be said to have any religion that takes it by another man's choice, not his own. When men are limited in matters of religion, there the rewards which are entailed on the free acts of men are quite overthrown, and such as supersede the grand charter or liberty of conscience, frustrate all hopes of recompense by rendering the actions of men unavoidable. But those think perhaps they do not destroy our freedom because they use so much of their own. Fifthly, they subvert all true religion, for where men believe not because it is true, but because they are required to do so, there they will unbelieve, not because it is false, but so commanded by their superiors, whose authority, their interest and security oblige them rather to obey than dispute. Sixthly, they can delude or rather compel people out of their eternal rewards, for where men are commanded to act in reference to religion, and can neither be secured of their religion, nor yet saved harmless from punishment, that so acting and believing disprivileges them forever that recompense which is provided for the faithful. Seventhly, men have their liberty and choice in external matters. They are not compelled to marry this person, to converse with that, to buy here, to eat there, nor to sleep yonder. Yet if men have power to impose or restrain in anything one would think, it should be in exterior matters. but that this liberty should be unquestioned, and that of the mind destroyed issues here, that it does not unbrute us, but unman us. For take away understanding, reason, judgment, and faith, and like Nebuchadnezzar, let us go graze with the beasts of the field. Eighthly and lastly, that which most of all blackens the business is persecution. For though it is very unreasonable to require faith, where men cannot choose but doubt, yet after all to punish them for disobedience is cruelty in the abstract. For we demand, shall men suffer for not doing what they cannot do? Must they be persecuted here if they do not go against their consciences, and be punished hereafter if they do? But neither is this all, for that part that is yet most unreasonable, and that gives the clearest side of persecution, is still behind, namely the monstrous arguments they have to convince the heretic with. Not those of old, as spiritual as the Christian religion, which were to admonish, warn, and finally to reject, but such as were employed by the persecuting Jews and heathens against the great example of the world, and such as followed him, and by the inhuman papists against the first reformers, as clubs, staves, stocks, pillories, prisons, dungeons, exiles, etc. In a word, ruin to whole families, as if it were not so much the design to convince the soul, as to destroy the body. To conclude, there ought to be an adequation or resemblance betwixt all ends and the means to them, but in this case there can be none imaginable. The end is the conformity of our judgments and understandings to the acts of such require it. The means are fines and imprisonments, and bloody knocks to boot. Now, again, these are the arguments in the Christian tradition. As you can see, Penn was a deeply religious man, and arguing from that Christian tradition. But even though he strongly rejects atheism and would not he certainly would not have approved of blasphemy, nevertheless, we need to uphold the traditional liberty of freedom of religion against people who would try to infringe it and take away that liberty under the spurious guise of protecting Muslims from prejudice. Obviously, there shouldn't be any any kind of discrimination against Muslims similar to racism. They should be protected as well as any other minority group, or even the majority. But there are dangers in the Islamophobia law, and we need to guard against them. Thank you for listening.